Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, and I am so pleased to welcome everyone today as we launch a new report on China's faltering zero COVID policy, politics in command, economy in reverse, in partnership with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Now, we have with us a truly expert group to unpack what is happening on the ground. And as you'll hear today, this has not been a typical report from the Atlantic Council. For starters, the writing has been done in the midst of a rapidly evolving situation over the past several months. And in addition, one of the co-authors, as you'll hear, has been living through lockdowns himself in China. Now, the official party line is that lockdowns are easing in several Chinese cities. We will discuss what's actually happening in reality. One data point from the economic perspective that bears repeating: not a single car was sold in Shanghai in April. And whatever happens next, the second largest economy in the world implemented sweeping and draconian measures, and these will have far-reaching ripple effects, both domestically, as President Xi tries to tighten his grip ahead of the Party Congress in November, and internationally, as China's economic slowdown may be a large driving factor in a global economic recession. So let's get to the report. I am so pleased to have my friend and colleague, Dave Schulman, with us to help moderate and introduce our panel. Let me turn it to Dave, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub.
Thank you, Josh. And thanks again to everyone joining us for today's discussion. I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion with our distinguished panel of experts, whom I'd like to introduce now. First up, we have Michael Schuman, a non-resident senior fellow here in the Global China Hub, and an author and journalist with more than 25 years of experience in Asia. Currently a contributing writer to The Atlantic, Michael was previously a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Time magazine. His most recent book is Superpower Interrupted: The Chinese History of the World. And his two previous books are Confucius and the World He Created and The Miracle, the Epic Story of Asia's Quest for Wealth. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Business Week, and Bloomberg Opinion. He's joining us today from Beijing. Hello, Michael. Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Jeremy Mark, a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa. As a non-resident senior fellow in the Geoeconomic Center, Michael focuses on US-China issues and developing country debt. He worked for the International Monetary Fund as a communications specialist for more than 2 decades, including as an advisor and speechwriter to the IMF management team. He also was responsible at various points in his career at the IMF for communications in Africa and Asia, as well as outreach on policy issues related to developing countries worldwide. Global interaction with legislators, trade unions, and civil society organizations, and interactions with the Chinese media. He also was a reporter and editor with the Wall Street Journal, the Asian Wall Street Journal, and CNBC Asia. Jeremy, it's great to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for being here. And finally, we also have Lingling Wei, the chief China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of Superpower Showdown, How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. Lingling covers China's political economy, focusing on the intersection of business and politics. Born and raised in China, Lingling got her start covering US real estate and has won many awards for her China coverage. In 2021, she was also among a team of reporters and editors whose work was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Lingling, it's great to have you back, and certainly good timing in light of some of the very compelling reporting you've been putting out in the journal on Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping's messaging on COVID. So we'll kick off today's discussion by asking Michael and Jeremy to share some of the key insights and takeaways from their new report before launching into our panel discussion. I want to remind our audience in Zoom to please submit your questions throughout today's event using the Q&A function, and we will get to audience questions toward the end of the program. With that, I'll turn it over to Michael to start and tell us a little bit more about the report. Michael, over to you.
Hey, thanks. Well, what I tried to do in the paper is highlight the political backdrop to China's zero COVID policy. And by talking about the political aspects of it, it doesn't mean that the leadership didn't have serious public health reasons for instituting this policy. This is a country with a very large, vulnerable elderly population and a terribly under-resourced healthcare system. So the leadership really did have serious concerns about what might happen if there is an uncontrolled COVID outbreak here. And by also talking about political aspects, it doesn't mean that the policy hasn't been tremendously successful, which it has in many respects, especially when in terms of preventing serious illness and death in ways that many other countries struggled with. But having said all that, I think the political aspects of this policy have become more and more important and become more to the fore as the pandemic has dragged on now and into its third year. And I think it explains a lot about what's happening now in China and why the leadership can't seem to chart a new course in light of what's going on and in light of what's changed in the last 2 years and how much more we know about COVID and what to do about it. It gets at the inflexibility that we see now in Chinese policy. The Chinese leadership, they had a great story to tell. Which they told everybody here at home, in China as well as around the world, that they had kind of figured out the COVID puzzle that no one else had figured out. That they had kept their country COVID free for very long periods of time, and that they use this narrative as a way of showing the competency of the Communist Party, the legitimacy of the party and the party rule, and also the superiority of in their mind, of the Chinese government system compared to others, especially democratic systems. And in doing that, I think they've boxed themselves in. They seem unwilling to move away from this narrative that they've created, and it's made it difficult for them to find a new course. But I think it's becoming increasingly apparent. This is something I'll be talking about over the next hour. That based on what's happening here, based on the economic and social costs, the growing political pressure here, that the leadership is going to have to find some new route out in dealing with COVID, different from what they are. Though right now on the ground, there's only very small signs of that actually happening.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, over to you for your initial remarks.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to Michael for his comments. I was tasked with taking a look at the economic situation in this paper, basically trying to demonstrate, at least as we looked at it back in January, that the economic chickens from COVID-0 were coming home to roost in China, despite last year's 8% growth. And there was limited data to support this proposition, but it was clear that the economy was slowing well before Omicron got in the door in China. So, it was clear that things were going to start to give. And by the time we put the paper to bed last month, the economic picture was much clearer. And since then, the economy essentially has fallen off the table. A couple of numbers. April retail sales in China fell 11%. Industrial production, which had been helping to drive the Chinese economy in 20 and 21, was down nearly 3% last month. Auto production was off 44%, and April property sales across the country were down nearly 50%. Now, of course, we have Premier Li Keqiang reported to be talking about negative growth in the current quarter. And in today's Wall Street Journal, thanks to Ling Ling's own reporting, we have clear signs of divergent messaging, at the very least, on COVID-0 between the premier and President Xi Jinping. But what we are witnessing right now is about much more than just the last few months of zero COVID. As we say in our paper, the original lockdowns of 2020 had a deep scarring impact on the economy, particularly consumer-facing sectors like retail, entertainment, restaurants, and tourism. But the other point we were making was that there's a lot more at play in the Chinese economy than just the impact of COVID and zero COVID. Most importantly, the current downturn reflects China's deepening property crisis, which is itself the result of overbuilding, over-indebtedness, and overconfidence over the last 2 decades. By one count, 18 major property developers have defaulted on bonds in the last 9 months. And there's this massive stock of pre-sold, unfinished housing across the country that essentially has left millions of Chinese as creditors to the developers while they've paid for their houses. They're waiting for them to be finished. One other issue that's played into this picture has been the decision in Beijing to crack down over the last year and a half on the big tech platform conglomerates like Alibaba and Tencent, which have been a major source of employment, especially for college grads, and also a major source of business dynamism in China. There may have been reasons to crack down because of monopoly behavior, because of the misuse of consumer data, which is a sensitive issue around the world and certainly in China. But the crackdown has ended up sapping business confidence and undermining financial markets in China at the moment when that's the last thing that the economy needs. Now, there are a lot of other issues we can get into. Most importantly, where do we go from here, and what has the government's response been? But I think in the interest of time, I'll stop here and turn it back over to Dave. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Michael. I think that was a very helpful overview of some of the main points in the report, and really gives a great foundation for where we've gotten to at this point with the zero COVID policy. I'd like to turn it over to Lingling now to offer an initial response or comment on what we've just heard. So Lingling, over to you.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's always a pleasure. I wanted to congratulate Jeremy and Michael on this very, very timely and insightful report. Obviously, zero COVID, this policy is something President Xi Jinping has made this overriding policy priority for China now, and has led to quite severe consequences in both China's economy and overall society. We're seeing costs just piling up on a daily basis now. And I wanted to address a couple of points that Jeremy made first, and then go to the point made by Michael. First, what Jeremy talked about is really the economic impact. The slowdown had already started even before the latest round of lockdowns, which is absolutely true, and a very good point that we should keep in mind. That so what happened was the list of policies Jeremy talked about: the crackdown on the property market, the crackdown on the private tech sector, et cetera, basically a series of policies President Xi Jinping launched last year, in the whole year last year. It's a huge, basically what people call economic rectification campaign. It's also a huge political gamble he took as he was, going into this year, right? Seeking unprecedented third term in office. So there are definitely, as Jeremy pointed out, economic and regulatory justifications for some of the actions, but the way it was carried out, right, the kind of campaign style, implementation, and basically, every ministry in China was tripping over each other to try to compete to see who is tougher on the private entrepreneurs, who's tougher on private developers. So that really shackled, the kind of entrepreneur energy that had powered China's growth for the past 4 decades. And, the confident business confidence, especially among private sector, it just, plunged. So at the end of last year, I think we all remember that big economic confab, very high level leadership meeting on the economy. We already saw signs of pushback from other parts of the government. And what we reported was late last year, the State Council, under the direction of Premier Li Keqiang, did many rounds of inspections across China and realized how some of the policies really triggered quite a plunge in not just the confidence, but actual activities from manufacturing to consumer side. So the course correction in China's policies already started late last year under in part under the influence Premier Li. So he already started to play a role. And fast forward to today, we are seeing obviously zero COVID has become increasingly unpopular. Michael can tell us more because you are right there in Beijing. Can you, I'm sure you will share with us. It would be great if you can share with us some of the mood and the stories you have heard, a conversation you had with people. So I just wanted to emphasize, I do think they are adjusting the policy a little bit, even on margin right now, albeit very quietly. So you very generously put up my story that ran yesterday. We talked about the divergent messaging from President Xi and President Li over the, how to tackle the pandemic. I think it was very telling that Li Keqiang basically highlighted vaccination as something the government will try to do better going forward. Vaccination really is one missing part in China's overall COVID defenses, because if you strictly implement zero COVID, that would involve repeated lockdowns. Repeated lockdowns would make it very hard to vaccinate the broader population, especially among the elderly. So inherently, those two measures are contradictory. So the fact that Li, during this meeting with multinational representatives, talked about that it was a sign that they're going to at least try to have put more efforts on vaccination. One more point I would add that kind of makes me a little bit hopeful that there's some adjustment down the road is the fact that Li Keqiang also held a very big econ meeting yesterday, where Jeremy talked about, this quarter, the second quarter, the economy is at the risk of contracting, forget about growth. So specifically in the meeting, he drew comparison between China's economic situation today to 2020, when the pandemic first started in China. The entire country was basically in lockdown. He said today's situation is even worse than before. So it's a veiled criticism of the current policy, the current excessive lockdowns, the restrictions that have been put in place. So of course he hasn't and he doesn't openly challenge, openly criticize the top leader. He's very cautious politician, and it's not going to. That's not how Chinese politics works. And someone openly criticizes the other, but just by saying that, by not defending zero COVID and by sending a different signal, a different message that shows the disagreement within the top leadership over the policy. So and because of the economic pressure, that all gives me a little bit of hope that some adjustments might be in the offing. However, overall, as Michael pointed out, just politically, just completely abandoning zero COVID is untenable. Thank you.
Thank you, Lingling. That was great. And you touched on a whole host of different issues that I hope we can get to in the next 40 minutes, including, why hasn't there been more of a focus on mandatory vaccinations, particularly for the elderly, as we watched these more draconian policies in other realms under zero COVID. What is the nature of China's economic policy been leading up to, even before we got to the pandemic, regarding the property sector, regarding what we were seeing in the tech sector and things like that, and how does that relate to what we're seeing? And then, of course, the leadership, elite politics issues that you've been writing about, which I definitely want to get to in a little bit. But I want to come back to Michael now, because as Ling said, I think we really want to to kind of dig into a little bit of your experience and what you're seeing as someone who is based in Beijing now. Before that, you were in Shanghai during lockdown as part of your move from Hong Kong. I want to ask, what has daily life under zero COVID been like for you? Do the images and the headlines that those of us outside of China are seeing match the realities on the ground? And what is the general feeling in Beijing these days about where things are headed, particularly this week with stepped up quarantine efforts, clamping down, it seems, on workplace attendance and on those who are flouting those instructions? And are people afraid that this might still go in a Shanghai-like direction? So just Michael, turn over to you for your thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, thanks. I'm in Beijing, and we're not in a Shanghai style lockdown here in terms of the whole city. We can leave our apartments unless you're in a quarantine or in a quarantined area, and there are still many of those. We are allowed outdoors, but the reality is there's really not much to do out there. I mean, huge parts of the city are shut down. Offices, shopping malls. I mean, even a park where we walk in the evenings is now shut. In my part of town, there's actually no public transportation at all. You can't even get a Didi or a taxi. You only can go as far as you can walk, basically. I've been calling it a stealth lockdown, where the city has been putting in over time more and more restrictions, and people's activities are becoming more and more constrained. And this is all happening when, my memory is right, I don't think we've had a day here yet where the number of cases has gone over 100. You're still not seeing anything close to a major health crisis in a city of 20 million people. So I think the result of this is that it's created a lot of frustration that people are basically not able to run their businesses. They're not able to, and even if they can open their businesses, they're seeing a fraction of the sales they used to. I go to a coffee shop nearby that's somehow remained open. They're doing just a very very small amount of their business. A place that would normally at lunchtime be like completely packed with people is just sitting there empty. But beyond the economic impact and the frustration of that, excuse me, people not being able to really lead their lives in a normal way. I think there's also a tremendous amount of fear, actually, that you live your life and you never really know what's going to happen that day. Is this a day when you're going to get a knock on the door and you're going to get thrown into some quarantine or locked into your apartment? And when you're locked into your apartment, what's going to happen? Are you going to have access to food? Are you not? Everyone is hoarding food. Do you have enough food? And what's going to happen to you in a government quarantine? How long will you be there? What will the conditions be like? And people are literally having nightmares about this, having dreams that the authorities are coming for them to take them away, that their family members are being taken, that they're starving in their apartments, they don't have enough food. Me myself, I tend not to sleep when I come under stress. So you find that you're living with this kind of underlying fear of what is going to happen in the next 5 minutes. And I think this is plaguing the entire city. This is what's been going on in Shanghai now for months. And this is something that is not taken into account in the zero COVID policy. They're defining public health exclusively as the case count of COVID cases. There's very little discussion of the broader consequences to what's happening to people living under these conditions over very long periods of time, and it's very there's really isn't a lot of debate about this. You know, the co-founder of Trip.com was talking about some of this, about the health costs of the lockdowns and what effect that might have. And, you know, he had his Weibo account closed. So a lot of these issues really aren't up for debate, which I think is one of the problems right now. I mean, China has gotten itself here, and you know, the Politburo just a couple of weeks ago came out and said they want to fight against any kind of, you know, distortions of the zero COVID policy. So from Xi Jinping's perspective, at least in terms of public discourse, you know, the case is somewhat closed.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that aspect of what's happening in China to millions and millions of people, and the human toll that this is taking, is something that you know, I think people have a vague notion of, but hearing you give us that first person account of what people are going through and what it means on a daily basis, and what probably is the long-term effects on people and their health and just their mindset, is I think really an incredibly important part of this conversation. So thank you. I wanted to shift now a little bit to the economic, back to the economic dimension, and ask Jeremy. We've been seeing, you know, as we've discussed, we just recently had a state council meeting on economic issues with, I think, a 33-point list of policies needed to be undertaken. We just had this call for reportedly, you know, 100,000 potentially officials at all levels throughout China on economic issues, chaired by Li. So I want to ask, you know, you, Jeremy, you know, where do you think things are going in terms of the full economic impact of the latest lockdowns as they become apparent? And do you think the outlook will get worse in the days and months ahead, particularly as variants get harder to contain, the property downturn continues, and which parts of the Chinese economy do you expect to be the most heavily impacted by what we're seeing now and in the weeks ahead?
Well, Dave, I think it's very clear that the essential part of the economy that is most important to millions of Chinese, which is to say the service sector, the consumer-facing part of the economy, which has been hit so hard, is going to continue to be hit hard. And this has real implications for employment in China. In the cities, the service sector is the most important employer by and large. People are home, jobs are being lost, and lots of small businesses are closing. And, you know, there's been one of the implications of Xi Jinping's economic rectification has been a turn towards state-owned enterprises again, government mandated policies that are channeled through you know, these behemoths that are seen as the future of China's development. But the reality is that it is the private sector still that's most important in the Chinese economy, particularly in terms of employment. And this part of the economy is really getting savaged. I think there's another issue that hasn't really been addressed a lot, which is in 2021, China was really saved by its exports. There was this massive demand from a world shutdown because of the pandemic for PPEs, for mobile devices. And China was in a position to provide it because supply chains run through China. And many of these goods are made in China or only in China. In addition, because China's initial zero COVID response was so effective, its industrial sector was able to get back up to speed very quickly. That export demand is not necessarily going to be there going forward. The world is moving beyond a lot of what it was buying from China. Obviously, China still is the workshop to the world, but in relative terms, there's going to be less demand for what China makes. And I think this is going to have an impact within China as well. And all of this sort of plays through the Chinese economy and then into the global economy. China's demand from really the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 onward, Chinese demand has been the most important driver of economic growth in the global economy. And that looks like it's starting to wither. And I don't think, as I said earlier, that China is going to bounce back the way it did a few years ago. And I think that will then sort of have ripple effects out to emerging market economies. Look at even Taiwan's export orders from China dropped sharply last month. It will play out to the developing economies that rely on Chinese demand for natural resources and raw materials. And this, will come at a time when the global economy is slowing. Josh talked about the possibility of recession, certainly. And if global demand drops off, then China is going to feel it even more going forward. So there's a lot that has to be taken into account in Beijing, and I'm not sure whether they are at this point seeing the big picture, frankly.
Yeah, I think all very important points. And as you've laid out in some of your writing, and as you kind of hinted at here, a lot of these emerging market economies and developing economies already facing, massive debt crises and the effects of the pandemic, in addition to what we expect to see in terms of the impact as a result of China's decreased demand. So we might kind of come back to that a little bit later. I wanted to invite Ling, if you had any additional thoughts you wanted to add on that, but I also wanted to come back to your reporting, and at the risk of delving a bit into elite politics here, I want to ask, with so much speculation currently, as there always is, in the lead up to the Party Congress and the status of Xi's power, what should we make of what you found in your reporting? There's a lot of alternate theories out there, as you know, about what we're seeing, including that this is Xi Jinping encouraging Li to do what he's doing, or that those who are supportive of Li are trying to bolster his legacy before he retires, as happened with Wen Jiabao in 2012. So why do you conclude that Li is genuinely trying to reorient, arguably, the ship of China's political economy, potentially creating this challenge of a sort to Xi Jinping?
Sure. Before I address your very big question, complicated question, I'd like to just follow up on what Jeremy just said. I completely agree that the consumer sector really is getting savaged because of all the bad policies. I would just add that not just service and and retail and that kind of businesses, manufacturing is getting hit very, very hard too. And as we know that China is trying to kind of refocus a little bit in the past few years to focus more on manufacturing as opposed to service, more like build up its capabilities as an industrial power. This whole goal of making the rest of the world more reliant on China and then China less reliant on the rest of the world. So manufacturing in certain sense is even more important to the top leadership than service. And I just had a conversation with the policy advisor the other day, and he was telling me that, with all the lockdowns, traffic stopped, truck drivers, in lockdowns, and, even if we encourage manufacturers to restart production, they can't get their people come to work, and they can't get supplies of components, and it's just very, very difficult situation as well. So I just wanted to add that one thing to Jeremy's excellent presentation, and also thank you, Michael, very much for sharing your experience. I've got family members scattered across China, and some of them have been locked down for more than 2 months. And the kind of toll on people's mental health, it's also very severe, in addition to economic costs. So to your big question, David, so what my reporting really is trying to show is, we're not really in the business of predicting outcomes. A lot of people think, is really speculative. I don't necessarily think so. I think what we're trying to do is really lay out the parameter of the battleground, so to speak, the parameter of the debate that is happening in China right now. And the debate very much involves this whole economic portfolio and the direction of China's economic policy. As many of you know, and our audiences know, in the past nearly 10 years, Li Keqiang has had very little to do with major econ policies. Xi Jinping has made himself this chairman of everything, which includes taking personal charge of economic management. We have seen he basically, for most part, has designated this whole task to his, economic right-hand man, Liu He, Vice Premier Liu He, high-level drafting of a lot of policies. And, if we have time, we can talk about how that worked out at some other point. And last year, he basically did all that thing, all those policies. He took personal charge. You can ping every move directly to him. So now, all of a sudden, but Premier Li is stepping out of the shadows, so to speak. Of course, it's still a very long shadow, but he's stepping out a little bit and becoming more vocal, holding state council meetings one after another. I did a rough analysis of his speeches ever since early April. None of those speeches, did he mention zero COVID. It was always about the economy. And we have seen within his power, he had made some policy adjustments. For example, in the past few years, China's central bank, when they put out policy recommendations, they would send the reports directly to the Central Economic and Financial Affairs Office under Xi Jinping, the head of that office is Liu He. They wouldn't even copy state council. And nowadays, you see the Keqiang, really playing a key role in terms of getting the central bank cut interest rates, lend more. And also we're seeing he really has led this rearguard effort to at least, suspend the kind of crackdown on private tech firms. Of course, the pressure hasn't gone away on those entrepreneurs, but he has made some effort to do that, based on our conversations with officials back in Beijing and people who were involved in the whole policy making process. So so we basically, all we're trying to do is lay out the parameter of debate and raise the point that yes, based on the evidence so far, Xi Jinping is still very much on track to secure another term. But the question is, will he stay as chairman of everything going forward? And the reporting so far shows that the economic portfolio is in play, which is very significant, because if you do have another manager of the economy who's less ideologically driven, who is more pragmatic, you're going to see changes in policy directions. But so far, we have seen some course correction. However, we haven't seen a wholesale, revamp of the economic policy. We haven't seen a return to reform and opening up. We haven't seen a return to a big scale economic liberalization, something China has badly needed for many, many years.
Great, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think, your reporting has been really fantastic, and I think has injected a lot of these questions that, need to be asked and are often asked in terms of, what's happening in terms of elite politics ahead of a party Congress. We've, I think, had less of that than we typically have just because of where things have been going under Xi Jinping. But reinserting that into the conversation, particularly as we talk about the policy challenges on the economic side, zero COVID, the Ukraine war, these kinds of things. I think it's helpful to have that context that you brought with your reporting. And I'll just inject and say that on June 1st, the Global China Hub and our friends at CSIS, my friend Jude and Chet, we're going to jointly host an event looking at some of these same questions about whether Xi Jinping's level of power and control over the Chinese system. So it's obviously something we'll all be focused on in the months ahead. On that, I want to kind of shift back to COVID, but in the same domain, and ask Michael, but also Jeremy and Lingling. Do you see what we're seeing in terms of the zero COVID policy as a unique product of the era of Xi Jinping and a demonstration of the perils of a return to something approximating one-man rule in China, and the undercutting of a more practical, technocratic policymaking that China had become known for? Or is that an overstatement? Is that too dramatic? And is this a unique situation? So, Michael, maybe we'll start with you and see if others have thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and point, because I've had people in the business community and elsewhere mention to me that generally policymaking in China in recent years has become more erratic. You were talking earlier about the this regulatory crackdown that seemed to kind of come it kind of hit the scene very quickly and in a very haphazard kind of way. And this kind of isn't the way that we're used to China doing things, right? China was always kind of this well-oiled technocratic machine. And here you have in this situation, zero COVID, where I think there are many people inside and outside of China looking at this and saying, well, something's gone kind of awry over there with the Chinese leadership. Why are they taking this approach when they do have other options, and why are they not following other options? Ling mentioned vaccinations, for instance, and I think you can't separate these issues from the rise of Xi Jinping and the way that he has changed the government system, where it's that idea of kind of almost like a government by committee, where there was power sharing that allowed space for experts, for different technocrats to express their opinions, at least in the halls of power. That there was more policy debate, especially on non-political issues, economic issues, and even to a great degree public debate in many ways. That space has been narrowing and narrowing in the Xi Jinping era, and he's increasingly taken control over the policymaking process, and the people involved in making policy increasingly are allies of Xi Jinping. So when you see what's happening with zero COVID, despite what you see happening on the ground and the economic chaos and the obviously growing public frustration and discontent, Xi Jinping, so publicly at least, is saying no, zero COVID is right for China, and so China has zero COVID. And I think this is a worrisome trajectory for China, that we're going back to this kind of one-man rule that the reformists in the late 1970s consciously wanted to move away from, based on the damage that was done by Mao and things like the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, where you had the authority of one man had become so great that he could basically determine the course of the whole country. The reform era was a reaction, against that. So I think what we have to worry about now is that, are we entering a new phase, or are we already in a new phase? Where the way that we've expected Chinese policymaking to work is really not that China anymore, that we're in a different China. We're in a China that kind of is regressing back to a different period, where policy is going to be run on the whims and ideas and political calculations of one person. And looking at the situation with zero COVID, you can project going forward the possible damage that can be done to China overall in terms of economic policy, but also what that might mean for foreign policy, and to just China become more erratic in its foreign policy as it has in domestic policy, and what does that mean, for example, for the likelihood of a war over Taiwan. So I think what the difficulty that the government is having dealing with COVID and finding a new route out of the zero COVID situation is really symbolic of much deeper issues about the way China is being governed right now and what it means.
Great, thank you, Michael. Jeremy, thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of points I want to make. Obviously, Michael has I think covered it quite broadly, and I agree with everything he just said. I kind of had a bird's eye view over the last 20 odd years to how the Chinese economic bureaucrats have played a key role in devising policy, in responding to issues that have arisen. I mean, this is the vantage point you can get if you work at an organization like the IMF. And I think it's very clear that what Michael is saying is, and what Ling Ling has been saying, exactly right, that this technocratic class has, if not been sidelined, their voices have been muted in the policy-making process. I've heard evidence to this from inside the IMF at times, and I think it's a matter of great concern. As a result, I think some of the responses you would have expected from the central bank or through, for example, the Ministry of Finance in terms of a fiscal response to the crisis have been more constrained than perhaps might have been the preferred response. Of course, there have been constraints as well because of the debt problem in areas like the financial sector and the property sector. So it's harder to open the taps like we saw in this country in Europe. But I think another issue is that this sort of more rigid ideological view has had an impact in another area, which is finding ways to get more money to people to spend, particularly lower income people. There was a speech that Xi Jinping gave in December that was published in the last 10 days in China for the first time, in which he was reinforcing zero COVID and was decrying things like welfareism, saying that you give money to poor people and they get lazy. There's been this whole debate over the notion of lying flat in China. And I think the idea of giving people fiscal subsidies, in essence, directly into their pocket, is seen as encouraging this kind of laziness. And it says a lot about the state of the Communist Party in the 21st century if they are not inclined to rely on the working class when there are problems.
I think that's a very good point, linking in what we've seen in terms of lying flat and what the government typically encourages people to do in terms of proactively participating and building a successful Chinese economy, and how that relates to what we're seeing with zero COVID and the extent to which the government's willing to extend relief. Ling Ling, did you want to come in on this, or anything else to add?
Sure. I just wanted to again follow up on very good points both Jeremy and Michael made. I completely agree with Michael. This whole zero COVID policy is only one of the symptoms of the current system, how the rigidity of the current system. If it is not zero COVID, it's something else. Right. And we can also point to the whole economic rectification campaign of the whole 2021. Again, that's also a reflection of, what the Chinese system has become of these days. So, and to Jeremy's point, I also completely agree that technocrats, traditionally the kind of voice for more practical measures to promote growth and more market-oriented reforms have been completely silenced in China these days. So that's why the question is, who is overseeing the econ portfolio going forward, so important. The other day I was just talking to a friend in China who's involved, policy advising, and he's telling me that, forget about technocrats. Now China is really being run by a bunch of securitycrats. I thought that's just such a, a great term that sums up the current makeup of the bureaucrats. And also another thing is that just on economic growth, I want, the whole, all the packages the government is initiating these days to save the economy. I feel like, they really do not need any more measures. All they have to do is roll back existing measures. That would help tremendously, unleash the growth potential in China. That's really the message I also got from talking to people on the ground in China. Forget about new messages. Just do away with all the crackdowns on the ideological constraints on us.
Yeah, excellent points. Thank you, Ling Ling. I want to go to an audience question, and I encourage folks in the audience to put in questions in our last 8 minutes here in the chat function. The question here is should zero COVID be taken at face value or other agendas at play? And I want to link that to some of the broader questions and something that I know, Michael, you've, I think, commented on regarding whether zero COVID leaves China more isolated internationally, and that whether we're seeing linkages internationally, including with the United States, but also just globally, that are breaking between China and the outside world and may not return. We've seen foreign businesses leaving or considering moving their operations outside China. We've seen delayed and decreased foreign investment. We've seen problems with international schools in China. The list goes on. So, I guess the question is, how long term do we expect these effects to be? And is it something that, in some ways, the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping personally thinks maybe actually a good thing that comes out of zero COVID and may in some ways be one of the motivators of the policy going forward. So maybe Michael, turn to you, and Jeremy and Ling Ling, please weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, zero COVID has just been accelerating some trends that I think you've seen going on in China over the last 4 or 5 years, where, there's a lot of discourse about, oh, well, should the US decouple from China? I think the reality of what's going on is that China is really decoupling from the US and actually much of the rest of the world. I mean, that's what self-sufficiency is all about. It's about import substitution. It's about, China trying to controlling as much of its own production as it possibly can. And so what you've seen happen with zero COVID, where the country in terms of international travel has been not entirely closed off, but closed to a great degree. Now, of course, recently you saw the government actually restrict the ability of Chinese nationals to travel outside the country as well. When you see the decrease in expatriate managers in China, and what also now growing frustration in the business community about what's going on. I mean, there was a very interesting survey done by the American Chamber of Commerce and just the last couple of weeks, saying that it showed that more than half of the respondents had already delayed or reduced planned investments in China. So, to a certain extent, you're seeing the zero COVID further isolate China and push China in a more insular direction that I think, in great degree, it was already heading, and that raises questions about, is the leadership necessarily unhappy with some of these effects of zero COVID? Obviously, they'd much rather see an economy that's doing better. But being that the leadership already seemed to be withdrawing from the world, some of these things that zero COVID has brought about may not appear to them as being that negative in the way that it would to us. And I think that raises another question about, I think we all assume in these debates that China is looking for a way out of zero COVID, and they just haven't been able to find one, either because of the politics or because of concerns about health issues or whatever the reason. I think we have to at least ask in this discussion as to whether that's really true. Maybe the Chinese leadership is really not looking for a serious way out of zero COVID, because the things that would you would think would bother them about it, at least some of them, may not necessarily. I think the leadership seems to be moving towards a way of maintaining zero COVID in some form, and yet trying to find a way of stimulating the economy and keeping the economy open. I think that's why you've seen this, for example, this new fixation on constant testing, which I think is going to be a fact of life here in Beijing and other major cities. And I think they may see that as a route of getting out of some of the economic fallout from zero COVID without really changing the zero tolerance approach.
Great, thanks, Michael. Ling Ling or Jeremy? Jeremy, go ahead.
Real quickly, because I want to give Ling Ling a chance to speak at the end. What we've seen happen with zero COVID, or should we say the reduced effectiveness of the policy, has been the impact of variants to the disease. There are going to be more variants, and it's possible that we would get a more infectious variant, or even one that returns to the severity of the very first version, so to speak, of COVID. So I think that the resolve of the leadership can be tested not just by economic trends, not by people in a city like Shanghai protesting against policies, but I think that zero COVID can be tested by Mother Nature itself.
Ling Ling, give the last word to you for a couple minutes.
Oh, sure. I'll just quickly add. I do think, within the government, obviously, there are different opinions and different views, but the top leader calls a shot on zero COVID policy. Based on my reporting, they did try to kind of having a pathway out earlier this year. They were racing to develop their own mRNA vaccines and trying to do all kind of other stuff. Even Xi himself, realized the economic costs and gave Shanghai a little bit leeway to try something different than locking down the entire city. Obviously, it didn't succeed because Omicron is so much more transmissible. So they're back to this very rigid, excessive zero COVID policy. Just about isolation in China. We reported on this high-level meeting Premier Li had with a group of multinational representatives, and throughout the meeting, repeatedly the representatives talked about China is becoming increasingly isolated because people don't want to be here anymore. The kind of lockdowns, and Li Keqiang appeared very concerned. He leaned forward and took notes and said something along the lines: is that we can't allow this to happen. There has to be human touch. There has to be human contact. So at least that conversation shows some people within the government are concerned about this. But how, if it will lead to any policy change, again, that's a bigger question. And I want to finish my remark with one email I received this morning from a friend in Shanghai. She wrote, feeling surreal writing this from the lockdown. It appears the door that opened to me more than 20 years ago to the world is now being shut. So that's the kind of sentiment from a lot of people in China these days.
Well, thank you, Ling Ling. I think that's a perfect way to end. This has been fantastic. Thank you to you, Ling Ling, and to Michael and to Jeremy. We've covered a lot of ground, including what's happening in the economic domain, what this means politically, what it means for China's linkages to the outside world and foreign policy. But I think we've also touched on, as you were just mentioning, Ling Ling, the human cost of what's happening inside China. And I think that that's obviously a really important aspect of this that needs to continually be explored and mentioned. I want to refer everyone back again to the fantastic report that we're here to discuss, put out by Jeremy and Michael. It's really an excellent overview of where we are with zero COVID and the drivers and where we can expect things to go politically, economically, and otherwise. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do so. And I just wanted to say thank you for everyone for joining us. And the Geoeconomics Center and the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council will be continuing to focus on this issue of zero COVID and where it's heading, the impact on the economy, and the impact as we head up to the 20th Party Congress in the months ahead. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.